The sun hung low and cruel over Del Agua, crossing its rays like hot iron brands pressed into the dust. At the edge of the cracked square, 3 men stood on a wood platform, wrists bound, eyes shadowed by wide-brimmed hats they weren't allowed to remove. One was barely more than a boy, trembling. One was missing a leg. The third, older, broad-backed with a scar tracing from jaw to temple, stared without blinking at the crowd like a man not looking at people but ghosts. The crowd, mostly ranchers and miners, whispered about the third. Been in the pits since childhood, someone muttered. A lifetime of darkness makes a man forget the sky. He wasn't priced like the others. The auctioneer, a portly man with a gold watch and stained boots, called out, strong back, quiet mouth, no known crimes. 39 years of age, calls himself Jude. Open and bid $30. Silence answered. Even the buzzards on the church roof went still. Then a voice, dry and reluctant. 25. Heads turned. A tall, gaunt rancher stepped forward, sun-creased face under a battered Stetson, a limp in his left leg. Elias Merritt. The same man who once rode broncs in Santa Fe, now known more for late payments than cattle yields. Sold, the auctioneer barked too quick. Jude was unshackled and handed a battered canteen. He didn't drink. Just walked down the steps like a man stepping into another cell. Elias didn't speak, just nodded and started walking. Jude followed. Around them, the town resumed breathing, but the dust in the air carried something else, a quiet reckoning like the sound before a rattlesnake strikes. Elias Merritt hadn't meant to come to town that day. He only meant to trade for feed, maybe pick up a new stirrup if the price was merciful. But the feed store had none, and the stirrup was too dear. And then there was the auction, and that look in the man's eyes like he'd already been buried and dug up again. The ride home was wordless. Elias rode. Jude walked, a rope tied loosely from the saddle horn to the man's wrist, not tight, not forceful, but a suggestion. Elias watched him in the corner of his eye, the way he moved like a man trained to disappear into shadows. The ranch was barely a ranch anymore. 27 head of longhorns, 2 mules, a barn with more holes than roof, and the house half-shuttered, 3 rooms and silence so deep it had a weight. Inside hung a photograph, dusty but framed, of a boy grinning in a school coat, his mother beside him with her arms wrapped firm. Neither was alive now. The boy had drowned 4 years ago, dragged under by a flash flood during a cattle drive Elias insisted was safe. His wife followed not long after, silent and hollow, never speaking of blame but never touching him again. That was when Elias stopped praying. Jude was given the bunkhouse, a sagging shack near the corral. No lock on the door. No need. First few days, the man worked like someone born to obey, mending fences, chopping kindling, hauling water from the spring without needing to be told. Elias didn't ask questions, didn't offer stories. They existed near each other like 2 coyotes in the same canyon, aware but distant. The silence only broke once 3 days in. Elias caught Jude out by the old stable fingers, tracing the wood beams like they were pages in a forgotten book. "You train horses?" Elias asked. Jude paused, then nodded once. "Used to," he said, voice graveled like it hadn't been used in months. That was all. But it was enough. That evening, Elias took down the saddle from its dusty rack. It still bore the brand of his old ranch, the one his father built before banks and droughts and death pulled it all under. He left it by the corral. Didn't say a word. Next morning it was gone, fitted on the back of a young stallion no one had managed to break. From the porch, Elias watched as Jude moved with the horse, not dominating it, not fighting it, but reading it like scripture. And the horse listened. Hours passed. The sun leaned westward. And for the first time in years, Elias felt something break open in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close. That night, as the wind stirred the sagebrush and the stars blinked awake, Elias sat by the dying fire and reached into the drawer beneath the floorboards. He pulled out a tin box, inside a crumpled letter from his son never sent, a newspaper clipping about a mine collapse in Santa Rosita, and a gold wedding band. He stared at them like they might accuse him. But they stayed quiet like always. He put the lid back on and slid the box away. In the bunkhouse, Jude stared at the ceiling, not blinking. He hadn't spoken again since the stable. but in his sleep he whispered names, none of them his. 2 weeks passed, maybe 3. The days bled together under the harsh New Mexico sun. Jude rose before first light and didn't stop moving until the sky bruised purple. He fixed the fence Elias hadn't touched in 5 years, dug a drainage trench near the barn that had flooded each spring since the war, even took to riding out with the cattle scouting for signs of disease or predators. Always quiet, always alone. Elias didn't ask him about the scars, though he saw them white and angry across the back, the shoulders, the neck. Some thin like whip lines, others thicker, puckered like old burns. You didn't earn marks like that in a bar fight. You earned them where men were made property. Still, it wasn't the scars that unsettled Elias most. It was the silence behind the man's eyes. A deep, still pool with no reflection. That kind of silence came from more than pain. It came from forgetting how to be a person. Then one hot morning, Ruthie showed up. Elias's niece, 17, sharp-tongued and too clever for the world, that waited outside her father's preacher house. She'd run away again 3 days riding on a mule named Agnes, braids, wild cheeks sunburnt. "You gonna turn me in or feed me first?" she said, grinning like sin itself. Elias didn't answer, just handed her a biscuit and muttered about chores. Ruthie saw Jude within the hour. He was hauling wood shirt soaked through shoulders, hunched like he expected a blow. "Who's that?" she asked. Elias just said worker. Ruthie watched him for a long while. That evening, while Elias hammered the barn door shut against a coming storm, Ruthie walked out to the field with 2 tin cups and a canteen, sat cross-legged beside Jude and offered one. He stared at her, then at the cup, finally took it. Drank slow. "You don't talk?" she asked. He shook his head. "Or you don't want to?" No answer. "Fine," she said, lying back in the grass. "You're better than most already." She talked then about her mother's rules, her father's sermons about how the world felt too small for girls who asked too many questions. Jude listened. Didn't nod, didn't speak. But he stayed. And the next day, when Ruthie tripped carrying a bucket of feed, it was Jude who moved first, steadying her by the elbow, eyes averted. "Thank you," she said, brushing hay from her skirt. He only looked at her then like he'd heard the word before but forgotten what it meant. That night, Elias found Ruthie in the loft, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the stars through the slats. "He's not like the men from town," she said. "He don't look at me like I'm prey." Elias sat beside her, bones creaking. "He's not from town, and he ain't free." Ruthie frowned. "You mean legally?" Elias said quietly that whatever held him still does. "Man like that doesn't walk upright unless he's been trained not to run." Ruthie didn't reply. But the next morning she left a folded kerchief on Jude's bunk, clean hand-stitched with a red thread flower in the corner. Jude stared at it for a long time. That evening he wore it around his wrist, not as decoration, as something close to belief. The first sign came in the form of hoof prints, deep wide, too many for casual travelers. Elias spotted them 2 ridges out on a routine cattle check. He didn't like their pattern, tight formation, looping back like they were looking for something or someone. He said nothing to Ruthie, just sharpened the axe and oiled the rifle he hadn't touched since the flood took his boy. Jude, though, noticed. He always noticed. One morning he stood by the gate holding a charred piece of leather he'd dug from the ashes of the cookhouse fire pit. A brand, a crude circular symbol scorched into hide. Elias stared at it for a long time. "You recognize it?" Jude nodded once. "Who are they?" Jude didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw told Elias enough. That night, Ruthie found Elias sitting on the porch, rifle across his lap. She asked what was wrong. He told her to keep to the house for the next few days and to stay away from the ridgeline. She didn't press, but Jude didn't sleep that night, nor the one after. 3 days later they came. 7 men on horseback. Dust dark, moving with a purpose. At the front rode a man in a brown duster, his face like dried leather, eyes pale as moonlight. A bullwhip coiled at his hip, gloves black and polished. He carried no rifle. Didn't need one. "Morning," the man said as he dismounted. Elias stepped out to meet him, rifle slung but ready. "Looking for someone." "Looking for property," the man replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Name's Bartholomew Crane. My men and I represent the Iron Circle. Elias said nothing, but Ruthie, watching from the loft, saw the way his fingers tightened on the rifle stock. Ain't no iron here, Elias replied coolly. Plenty of rock and dust. Not much else. Crane's smile widened. We're looking for a man. 39. Escaped from a work camp down near Santa Rosita. Been gone a while, but these things catch up. Name's Jude. Strong back. Mute, mostly. You'd know him by the eyes. Burned into your memory like soot. Elias met his gaze. Ain't seen him. Mind if we look around? I do, in fact. Crane took a slow step forward. His men shifted in their saddles. The tension hung like a razor in the wind. You bought him, Crane said softly. Back in Agua Crossing. $25, cheap, but I imagine you were desperate. The man don't belong to you. Never did. Then who does he belong to? Elias asked. Crane's smile faded. To the mines. To the circle. To the contract signed when he was 11 years old. Makes him bound until death. Jude stepped out from the barn, then calm eyes fixed on Crane. Crane didn't flinch. There, he said, voice almost tender. You look worse than I remember. Life free don't suit you. Jude said nothing, just stood there. Crane turned to Elias. You think you're helping him? You're not. He's a stolen tool, a runaway plow. We built him, broke him, and we always collect what's owed. What he owes you. Elias said he's already paid in blood. Not to me, Crane replied. To the investors, to the system, to the idea of order. He turned to Jude. You coming back, or we got to make this ugly? Jude's eyes never moved. Elias saw the man's hands twitching slightly at his sides. Not fear, calculation. Crane watched the hesitation and sighed. Then we come back tomorrow, sundown. He walks out with us or we take him out. And if the girl's still here, his eyes flick toward the loft, she walks too. Elias took one step forward, rage bubbling like tar under his skin. You lay a hand on her. We don't lay hands, Mr. Merritt. We erase. Quietly. Crane mounted again, tipped his hat. One day, then we burn it all down. They rode off without hurry, their dust settling slow like ash after a fire. That night Elias sat with Jude in the barn, a lantern flickering between them. You could run, Elias said. I'd cover your trail. Might get far if you ride hard. Jude shook his head. Then fight, Elias said. I've got powder shot and 2 rifles. It's not much, but it's enough to hurt. Jude finally spoke, voice low. They'll kill you. Maybe. Elias looked toward the house. But if they touch her or put you back in chains, I'd die anyway. Jude stared at him long and deep. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded square of cloth. Not the kerchief. A fragment of an old flag red with a faded white mark across the center. He laid it on the table. We don't fight to win, he said. We fight to be free, even if only for a day. Elias nodded, and the 2 men, one broken by guilt, one broken by years of ownership, began planning a war. The canyon that cradled Elias Merritt's ranch was narrow and cruel, rock walls jagged like a broken jaw, choke points hidden beneath sagebrush and fallen limbs. It had served him well over the years as a natural fence for cattle, but now it was something else entirely. A battlefield. He and Jude spent the night setting traps, wire nooses buried in dust, trip lines wound through brush, old dynamite sticks Elias hadn't dared touch since he'd bought them a decade ago from a traveling miner. Jude moved with purpose, wordless like a man who'd done this before. At dawn, Ruthie tried to stop them. You'll die, she said to Elias, tears hot in her voice. He ain't worth it. Elias didn't answer right away. Just strapped on his old revolver, checked the cylinder. I thought the same thing, he finally said, until I saw what a man becomes when the world don't think he's worth saving. He looked her in the eyes then. Stay in the root cellar. Don't come out no matter what you hear. If it all goes to hell, run. Don't wait for ghosts. She wanted to argue, but something in his voice silenced her. Not fear, not even finality. Just peace, deep and still like a grave that had already been dug. The sun hung heavy and orange when they took their positions, Jude atop the bluff with Elias's Winchester, Elias crouched behind the corral's stone wall, revolver and scattergun at hand. They didn't wait long. Dust trails shimmered on the horizon. 7 riders, same as before, but now armored in malice. Bartholomew Crane led them, his duster flapping like a shadow's wings, whip uncoiled in one hand. They didn't slow when they saw the empty yard, didn't suspect. Not until the first wire snapped. The front horse screamed as it went down, leg twisted in a snare. Its rider flipped forward into a spike pit Elias had disguised with straw and old canvas. The scream that followed wasn't equine. It was human and wet. Crane's head snapped toward the sound just as the Winchester barked. A man 2 paces behind him jerked, red blooming on his chest. Another fell as he dismounted, lead cracking bone through his thigh. Elias waited, watched, judged the rhythm of their panic. Then he rose and fired both barrels into the nearest rider, the scattergun erupting like thunder in the canyon. The man flew backward, his face unrecognizable. Chaos broke then. The iron circle spread out, yelling, shooting wildly toward the bluff. Jude moved rock to rock, precise as a scalpel, his shots spaced calm. Elias fired again, then ducked low, rolling behind a water trough just before bullets chewed into the wall behind him. One grazed his arm. Another shattered the trough's far edge, spraying water and splinters. Crane shouted orders, but the panic was in his voice, now ragged and raw. 3 of his men were dead. A 4th was crawling, screaming for his mother. And still Jude hunted. One rider managed to flank, climbing the ridge with a Bowie knife between his teeth. He reached Jude's blind spot, but Jude turned just in time, met him not with the rifle but with his hands, silent, brutal. The fight was short, and when it was done, Jude stood over the man's twitching body, his knuckles bleeding. Elias, meanwhile, was running out of shells. He reloaded behind the barn chest, heaving blood soaking through his sleeve. Then he saw Crane. The man stood alone now, whip in one hand, pistol in the other, coat tattered, hat gone. He wasn't scared, he was furious. "I built you," Crane roared toward the bluff. "I fed you, bled for you, and this is how you repay me." He turned slowly, saw Elias, and smiled. "You think you've won," he said. "You think freedom is a day's fight. You've just stolen hours, Merritt. We'll come again. The circle don't forget." Elias stood, leveled the revolver. "Neither do I," but his shot went wide. His vision blurred. Crane fired back, and Elias felt the fire tear through his gut. He dropped, gritting his teeth against the scream. Crane advanced. "You should have sold him back," he muttered. "You'd still have your land, your life." Behind him Jude appeared, no gun, just a jagged piece of iron from a fence post. Crane turned too late. The strike caught him across the face, splitting cheek to chin. He howled, swung the whip, cracking it into Jude's ribs. But Jude didn't fall. Didn't stop. He drove the metal into Crane's chest once, twice, 3 times, until the man collapsed like a dropped cloak breath, bubbling red. Silence returned. Not peace, just the end of noise. Jude dropped the iron, turned to Elias, who was bleeding out behind the barn. "Get Ruthie," Elias rasped. Jude knelt beside him, pressed a hand to the wound. Too late, Elias wheezed. "Don't lie." Jude didn't. He just gripped the old man's hand tight. "You were right," Elias whispered. "We fight to be free." His eyes fluttered, even if only for a day. Then the hand went still. Ruthie found them an hour later, trembling, wide-eyed. Jude sat beside Elias's body, eyes dry. He looked at her, then at the rising sun. The blood on his shirt had already dried. Ruthie knelt beside Elias, wept into his chest. Jude stood and walked away. Not far. Just enough to let the sky take him. He didn't look back. He never did. 2 days passed. The sun climbed, fell, and climbed again, indifferent. Ruthie buried Elias behind the barn where the prairie wind could touch his grave. She carved his name into a plank and drove it deep into the soil. No sermon, just silence, and a stone laid gently by his favorite horse. The iron circle didn't return. Not that week, not the next. Jude stayed, though not as a servant nor as a guest. He fixed the broken corral, split firewood, and each night sat beside the grave for an hour, still as the stone. Ruthie watched him, sometimes from the porch, sometimes from the loft where the scent of Elias's old tobacco still lingered. She didn't speak until the third week, when she brought him coffee and bread at sunrise. "You ain't got to stay," she said. "He wouldn't want you chained to this place." Jude took the cup, nodded thanks, but said nothing. "I saw you fight," she added, voice low. "You weren't scared, not of death, not of pain." He looked out toward the far hills where vultures wheeled in lazy arcs. "Been dead already," he said finally, "for a long time." That night he told her in pieces, voice cracking on words he hadn't said in years. He'd been taken at age 9, not 11, ripped from a border village no one remembered. His name wasn't Jude, it had been Esteban. But they burned that out of him. The Iron Circle wasn't just a gang. It was a system, an invisible cage built by investors, railroad men, distant judges who signed off on indenture contracts that no child could read. They sent him to the mines in Santa Rosita. The sun vanished. Years passed beneath ground. Pickaxes, chains, beatings for anyone who dared raise their voice. When the collapse happened, the one Elias had once read about, it wasn't an accident. It was a revolt. Esteban had led it. They'd tried to seal the mine with them inside. But a few got out. A few, including Esteban, ran. For months he'd wandered, starving, hunted like game. Eventually he reached the northern camps, changed his name, offered his back for labor, and kept his head down. Always moving, always hiding, until Agua Crossing, until Elias. Ruthie sat beside him the whole time, the lantern between them flickering like a dying heartbeat. He didn't know, she whispered. "My uncle." About the mine, about what they did. "He didn't need to," Jude said. "He treated me like a man." That was enough. But Ruthie had learned something else too. In Elias's box, the one beneath the floorboard, there were old receipts, dividends from an investment his father had made long ago. In a silver mine, Santa Rosita. "He profited from it," she said, trembling, "all those years. He lived off your pain." Jude didn't flinch. "That's the world," he said. "Built on bones of the quiet, but he fought for you." "Yes." Jude looked at her, eyes softer now. "He died trying to undo what his bloodline did. That's more than most." Ruthie didn't sleep that night. She stared at the rafters, her thoughts gnawed by guilt and awe, sorrow, and some seed of strange peace. Elias had carried shame like a coat, worn heavy but never discarded. And in his final days he had done what so few ever dared. He had chosen to love the very person his heritage had destroyed. That, she realized, was freedom. Not in papers or land, but in action. The next morning Jude was gone. No note, no trail. Only the stable door left open, the saddle missing, and his bed perfectly made. But he left behind one thing. On the barn door, carved with a knife into the wood just above Elias's bloodstain, was a circle broken through at the top, pierced by a rising sun. A miner's mark. The sign of a free man. Not erased, not owned, just remembered. The ranch stood still in the weeks that followed, held together by sweat memory and a girl who had grown into something harder and wiser than her 17 years. Ruthie took to the chores without complaint, mending fences, branding calves, brushing down the mules. The silence became her companion. At night she'd sit on the porch, Elias' once favored feet on the railing, shotgun across her lap, not from fear but from habit. She kept the barn door untouched. Where Jude had left his mark, the wood was scorched, stained, and sacred, a circle broken by the sun. It became a kind of altar. Travelers came by, curious about the place, about the smoke that once rose in the canyon. Some claimed to have heard about a massacre. Others spoke of a rider in gray who freed children from work camps and vanished like fog. Ruthie said little, but she always pointed them to the door. The truth she knew didn't need retelling. It was written in blood and sacrifice, in the hush of men who had nothing left but still gave everything. One evening a boy arrived, no older than 10, barefoot, ribs showing. Said nothing, just stared at the mark. Ruthie gave him bread and water, a cot in the loft. The next day he started hauling feed without being asked. She never told him to leave. The ranch became more than it had ever been. Not profitable, not powerful, but clean, honest. The land seemed to breathe different, as if Elias's death had cleansed the soil and Jude's escape had broken the chain binding them all to a past they never chose. One afternoon, Ruthie found the old tin box again. She opened it slowly. The wedding ring, the boy's letter, and the clipping about the mine. She burned it all, every trace. Let the smoke carry it away like a confession whispered to the wind. What mattered now lived in her hands, her sweat and the creak of saddle leather in the evening light. Far off the buzzards still circled, but they were fewer now. And Ruthie stood tall when she watched them. Somewhere beyond the red hills where the land folds into forgotten valleys, a rider with scarred hands and quiet eyes crosses borders no map records. He wears no brand, carries no name. But every now and then at the edge of a town, a mark appears carved into wood, a broken circle pierced by mourning. And folks say they feel something when they see it. A kind of stillness, a kind of reckoning, maybe even grace. It's in these moments, brief as a dust swirl, that stories outlive the men who lived them. And legends begin with what one man refused to remain. If this story moved you, if it left a mark just like Jude's symbol on that barn door, don't let it fade. Hit that like button, subscribe for more Western tales that dig deep into the soul, and ring the bell so you don't miss what comes next. There's always another legend riding in.